Hello, everyone. I hope you will support the discussion in the comments and tell me what you would do if you found yourself in the situations I am going to talk about today. On a peaceful Saturday morning, I was enjoying my coffee while gazing at the forested pathway that runs behind my residence. Having spent nearly a decade there, I was well acquainted with the neighborhood, particularly with the recent influx of opulent homes on the far edge of my property. These multi-million-dollar mansions were nice, but not really my style. Good for those who could afford them. One day, I received a letter in my mailbox. It came from a homeowners association, HOA, that I wasn't even a member of. It wasn't from the city or anything official. The letter stated that since I wasn't a resident, I couldn't use the road near their houses. I assumed it was a joke. The road is public after all. It wasn't theirs to claim. Initially, I disregarded the letter. I wasn't a member of their HOA, so I didn't have to follow their rules. However, a few days later, a woman in a shiny SUV pulled up next to me while I was walking my dog along the public road. Her voice brimming with entitlement, she said, "You can't walk here. This is for residents only." I simply grinned and carried on. But things escalated. A few days later, someone broke into my mailbox and left a note that read, "Stay out of our neighborhood." I had no proof, but it didn't take a genius to figure out who was behind it. However, I wasn't going to let these people push me around. A week or two later, as I was driving home, the HOA president was standing in the middle of the road, blocking my path. He gestured for me to stop. When I rolled down my window, he addressed me directly, saying, "You don't live here. You're not allowed to drive through this area." Normally, I'm a pretty calm person, but this guy had crossed the line. "This is a public road," I declared. "You don't own it, and you can't tell me what to do." His arrogant response, "We are represented by attorneys. We will ensure that people who depress our property values are not among us." That was it. I wasn't going to tolerate their bullying any longer. I went to the city office and obtained the local property records. Sure enough, the road was open to the public, and the HOA had no legal authority to close it off or post signs claiming it was a private road. I didn't stop there. To cover all my bases, I hired a lawyer. We wrote the HOA a letter threatening to sue if they continued to harass me or deny me access to public property. We also demanded compensation for the harassment and the damage to my mailbox. Then came the interesting part. The city had already been monitoring the opulent homes. It turned out that some of them were encroaching on protected land and violating building codes. My complaint triggered the city to take action. My lawyer attended the next HOA meeting, where the members got hit with a double whammy. Not only was I prepared to sue them, but the city was also investigating zoning violations. Some of their homes had been built too close to wetlands, and they hadn't obtained the necessary permits. The HOA quickly tried to make amends. They offered me money in exchange for my silence and agreement to stay away. I declined. I wanted them to be held accountable for their actions. In the end, the HOA had to pay for the repairs to my mailbox and was fined by the city for their illegal road signs. Some of the mansions were even forced to demolish portions of their illegally constructed properties. After the president was voted out, a few homeowners moved away because they could no longer afford the fines and legal battles. As for me, I continue to walk my dog down that road whenever I please, always making sure to wave at the few neighbors who still have the audacity to look my way. It's amazing how quickly things change when you stand up to people who think they're above the law. Before the next story, I would like to ask you to like this video and subscribe to my channel. Let's move on to the next story. When I was in my mid-20s, fresh out of grad school, I was filled with excitement and optimism about starting my teaching career. I had landed a job teaching art at a local elementary school and was thrilled that I could even walk to work. Everything seemed perfect, and I couldn't wait to get started. But, in my blissful excitement, I completely missed some warning signs that things weren't going to be as smooth as I had imagined. The first warning sign came when I tried to prepare for the upcoming school year. It was about a week before classes were set to begin, and I hadn't received my keys or staff badge yet. I called and emailed the school's office and the principal to find out how I could pick them up. Days went by with no response. After several attempts, I finally contacted the district office to ask when and where I could get what I needed. That seemed to have triggered something because 2 days before school started, I received an email from the principal saying I should have been more patient and should not have contacted the main office. I was taken aback by the response, but I shrugged it off, thinking maybe it was just a misunderstanding. When I finally got into my classroom, I was horrified by what I saw. My classroom, which was supposed to be a clean, inviting space to inspire creativity, was a disaster. It had clearly been used as a storage room. Desks and tables were stacked on top of each other. There were 8 filing cabinets crammed in one corner, and there were over 100 chairs scattered around. The task ahead of me felt overwhelming, but with the help of the school custodian, who, by the way, was an absolute lifesaver, I managed to clear out the room and make it presentable. That was the first major hurdle, and I thought the worst was behind me. But the second warning sign appeared on the first day of school. I had not received any information about the schedule. I had no idea which classes I would be teaching. when I'd see them, or how my day would be structured. In a mild panic, I sent an email to the principal, politely asking if there was a schedule I could use to plan my day. Her reply was shocking. She accused me of pressuring and bullying her. Confused, I apologized if I had come off as pushy, but reiterated that I needed the schedule to do my job effectively. That's when I received the third warning sign. It was 8:10 a.m., and school had just started. I finally received my schedule. However, the schedule showed that I was assigned 2 classes at the same time. In total, there were 14 classes at the school, spanning kindergarten to 6th grade, and I would be seeing every class every day. This meant I would have over 46 students in my classroom at once, with no help and only 45 minutes to teach each group. On top of that, I had 7 periods a day, and my so-called lunch break was actually lunch duty, where I was responsible for monitoring the cafeteria. When I approached the principal about adjusting the schedule, hoping to make it more manageable so I could actually plan lessons and give the students the attention they deserved, she dismissed me. She told me I was a first-year teacher and didn't know what I needed, so I should just deal with it. Frustrated but determined, I did some research and found a clause in the teacher's contract that stated if a class had more than 30 students, the teacher was entitled to an educational assistant. Armed with this information, I went back to the principal, hopeful that we could solve the problem. But, unsurprisingly, she denied my request, saying there was no budget for an assistant, and I'd just have to make do or quit. I wasn't about to quit. Instead, I dug in my heels and tried to make the best of a difficult situation. I arrived at the school at 6 a.m. every day and stayed until 9 p.m. just to keep up with grading, lesson planning, and administrative tasks like referrals and parent communication. My weekends were spent doing more of the same, and it felt like I was drowning in work. Despite the chaos, my first teacher evaluation went well. The principal gave me satisfactory marks across the board, which surprised me. I didn't know it at the time, but this was part of a larger plan she had in mind. A few more weeks passed and things became unbearable. Managing 46 kids in one classroom was not sustainable, and I knew it wasn't safe. I reached out to our teachers' union for help, hoping they could intervene. But after a few weeks of inaction on their part, I felt like I was on my own. Around Thanksgiving, I attended a potluck dinner with some old friends, hoping to escape the stress of work for a few hours. As we chatted, the conversation inevitably turned to work, and I found myself venting about my situation. I talked about how amazing the students were, how creative they could be, but how difficult it was to give them the time and attention they deserved when I was juggling 2 classes at once. One of my friend's new spouses, who I hadn't met before, raised an eyebrow and asked which school I worked at. I told him, thinking it was just casual conversation. But as it turns out, this man was not just anyone. He was my principal's supervisor. I had no idea at the time, but his curiosity would end up being the turning point. When I arrived at school the following Monday, the principal stormed into my classroom, furious. She screamed at me, threatening to fire me and make sure I never worked in education again. I was shocked and confused until it clicked that my conversation at the potluck had somehow made its way back to her. However, that very same week, during a staff meeting, there was an unexpected change to the schedule. Now, I would only have 1 class at a time, for an hour each, and I'd see them twice a week instead of every day. It was a dream come true. The students were happier, I was finally able to plan lessons properly, and I could even leave the school at a reasonable hour. For a while, it felt like everything was going to be okay. But, of course, the sense of calm didn't last. After the schedule change, I noticed the principal hovering around my classroom more often than usual. It felt like she was watching me constantly, waiting for any small slip-up she could use against me. At first, I tried to brush it off, but it was impossible to ignore. She would come into my room, sometimes multiple times a day, just standing there without saying a word, clipboard in hand, taking notes. Her presence was unnerving, and I could feel her scrutinizing my every move. The atmosphere became tense, not only for me but for my students too. Some of my more outgoing students, the ones who usually bounced into class full of energy and enthusiasm, began to seem quieter. They were withdrawn, and I could see something was bothering them. When I asked if everything was okay, they would burst into tears, saying things like, "I don't want you to go," or "Please don't leave us." Their words confused me. Why would they think I was leaving? I reassured them, telling them that I had no plans to go anywhere, and that they were the best students any teacher could ask for. My words seemed to comfort them temporarily, but the next week they'd be upset again. Then, just before we left for the winter break, it all became clear. The principal walked into my classroom, this time with one of her close allies, a fellow staff member who also happened to be our building's union representative. Without much of an introduction, the principal informed me that I was being placed on a teacher support plan. This was basically a formal way of saying that my job was now under scrutiny, and if I didn't improve, whatever that meant, I could be let go by the end of the school year. The timing couldn't have been worse. The holidays were supposed to be a time to relax and recharge, but instead, I felt blindsided and betrayed. To make things worse, my union rep, who was supposed to advocate for me, just smirked as if this whole situation was a joke, then walked away with the principal, giggling like they had already won. I was left standing there, feeling sick to my stomach. When I got home that night, I finally read the details of the support plan, and that's when my anger turned into something more. I was furious. The plan was filled with vague criticisms and unrealistic expectations. It became obvious that this was a setup to push me out of my position. But if they thought I was going to roll over and accept this, they were wrong. It was then that I began to formulate a plan of my own. Over winter break, I kept a low profile, but I didn't stop thinking about how I was going to handle this situation. Then, one evening, the acquaintance and his husband, the same couple from the potluck, invited me out for drinks. Given the stress I was under, I welcomed the distraction. At first, we talked about anything other than work. I wanted to avoid rehashing the drama from school, but eventually, the conversation shifted back to my teaching situation. The husband, who I now knew was my principal's supervisor, asked me if things had gotten better since we had last spoken. It was then that I realized he was the key to turning this all around. I hesitated at first, but eventually I told him everything. About the teacher support plan, the constant observations, the threats, and how my principal had been making my life a nightmare. As I laid it all out, I watched his expression change from concern to shock, and then to outright anger. He listened carefully, and when I finished, he said something that gave me hope. I always had a bad feeling about her. It never made sense why there was so much turnover at that school every year, but I had no idea things were this bad. What else can you tell me? That was all the encouragement I needed. I began sharing every detail about what had been happening at the school, her erratic behavior, her constant absences, the favoritism, and even her sketchy relationship with the after-school care provider. As I talked, both he and my acquaintance sat in stunned silence, occasionally exchanging glances. By the end of our conversation, the husband looked like he was ready to explode. He assured me that he would look into everything I had said, but he also warned me to keep my head down for now. We didn't want to tip the principal off that things were about to change. I walked away from that conversation feeling more empowered than I had in months. When school resumed after the holidays, I dreaded walking back into my classroom. The anxiety was still there, but I felt a little more prepared, knowing that someone higher up was on my side. As I walked down the hall to my mailbox, a group of students spotted me and ran up to me, giving me the biggest hugs. "You're here! You're here!" they exclaimed. "Of course I'm here," I said, smiling down at them. "I told you I'm not going anywhere." That's when one of the students let something slip that almost made me lose my composure. "But the principal said you were leaving us because you didn't want to be here, and that we should give you trouble before you left." My heart sank. I had suspected she was up to something, but hearing this from a child was a punch to the gut. I had to fight to keep my anger in check as I reassured them. "Maybe she was confused," I said, forcing a smile. "I think she was talking about me visiting family over the break. Don't worry, I'm still here." I could barely believe what I had just heard. The principal had gone so far as to manipulate my students into misbehaving in order to make me look bad. It was clear she was trying to create a false narrative that I didn't have good rapport with the kids, all to build a case against me. That's when I knew it was time to escalate my plan. I asked one of my more creative students to draw a comic book based on the conversation they had with the principal, making sure to include how they felt about me supposedly leaving. This would be phase 1 of my plan. Phase 2 involved contacting my principal's boss, the same man who had become my unexpected ally. I requested, per my contract, that another administrator be present for every one of my support plan observations. Specifically, I asked for him to be there. He agreed, and we decided not to inform the principal ahead of time. The first day of my observation rolled around. The principal strutted into my classroom, looking smug, without even a notepad in hand. She seemed so sure of herself, like she had already won. But then her face fell as her boss walked in behind her, laptop in hand, ready to take notes. Her confidence wavered as she scrambled to find something to write on, asking me for paper. I calmly responded, "I don't have any extra notepads, but I do have some poster paper we're using for a project. I hope next time you can be better prepared, as not to disrupt the students' instructional time." Her boss smirked in the corner, and I could see the frustration building on her face. Phase 3 of my plan kicked into action immediately after that first observation. It involved documenting everything. I made sure to report every time the principal was late arriving at school, something that had become a regular occurrence. She had a habit of strolling in hours after contract time, with no one holding her accountable. Now I had an insider who was keeping track. Her supervisor, my new best friend, would randomly stop by the school whenever she was running late. He would document her tardiness and note that she wasn't submitting the necessary paperwork to have those late arrivals counted as leave. This happened about twice a week for a solid month. The cherry on top? He even had someone from HR come in one morning around 9 a.m., only to find that the principal still hadn't shown up. But phase 4 was my favorite. This phase was all about getting the parents involved. I had already noticed that many of the parents struggled with the after-school care program, often picking up their children late because they couldn't afford the service. This struck me as strange since our school, being a Title I school, was eligible for free after-school care, paid for by the district. So, I started casually mentioning this to the parents I saw frequently. I'd say things like, "Did you know after-school care is supposed to be free for our students?" and handed out little flyers I had created with the necessary forms and website information to apply. Word quickly spread, and soon enough, parents who had been paying out of pocket realized they were being taken advantage of. They were understandably furious. At the next PTA meeting, the tension was palpable. Parents demanded answers, wanting to know why they had been paying for something that was supposed to be free. The principal, who had clearly been caught off guard, tried to deflect the questions, but it was too late. And just to make sure she knew where the information had come from, I made it a point to smile and wave at her across the room. She gave me a glare that could have melted steel, but I felt nothing but satisfaction. Shortly after that, a full-blown investigation was launched. Auditors, administrators from the district office, and even the union, who had previously done nothing to help, were suddenly very involved. They were now trying to play the role of heroes, pretending they had been on my side all along. It was laughable. The result of all these investigations was a school year that, for the first time, felt manageable. My principal was no longer allowed to do my evaluations, and her ability to perform informal observations was revoked. My support plan, which had been nothing more than an attempt to force me out, was removed from my teaching record. The after-school care contractor was fired, and a new program recommended by the district took over. Most importantly, my students thrived. With a more reasonable schedule, I had the time to focus on their work, and they were making huge strides in their projects, especially their movie posters and comic books. The classroom became a place of joy again, filled with creativity and laughter, instead of the constant stress and anxiety that had plagued it before. As the end of the school year approached, there was one final showdown. The principal, in a last-ditch attempt to get rid of me, called me into her office and tried to tell me that the budget didn't have room for an art teacher next year. She suggested I start looking for another job. I couldn't help but laugh out loud. "Nice try," I said. "My position is paid for by a state bond, not your district budget, so I'll be staying right where I am. If that's all, I'll be heading out now." I turned and walked out of her office, feeling triumphant. As I closed the door, I heard a loud thud, likely her slamming her desk, and a string of swearing. It was the sound of her defeat. By the time the final school bell rang, signaling the last day of the year, I was ready to celebrate. But there was one more surprise in store. At our school's talent show, one of my students decided to share the comic book he had been working on for months. This was the same student I had asked to draw a comic based on the principal's manipulation, where she had tried to convince him I was leaving. In front of a packed gymnasium, he proudly presented his comic, which depicted the angry principal as the villain, trying to trick the students into giving the art teacher trouble. In the end, the students and the art hero rallied together, and the angry principal was forced to leave the school, restoring happiness to everyone. The principal, already on edge from the PTA revolt and the investigations, rushed onto the stage in a panic, trying to stop him from finishing. But it was too late. The parents in the audience were already upset about what had been happening behind the scenes, and seeing the comic play out in real time only fueled their anger. I even think one particularly outraged parent threw a shoe at her as she hurried off stage. To the surprise of absolutely no one, the very next day, the principal made an announcement over the intercom. It was the last day of school, and with the students already gone, she decided to share the news that she would be resigning from her position. She claimed she was needed elsewhere and would miss almost all of us, though the sentiment in her voice was far from heartfelt. A few years later, out of curiosity, I looked her up online. She had managed to get another administrative job, but it was in a district an hour away. The following year, she had to step down from that position and ended up teaching English at a high school. It seemed like she could no longer hold on to any leadership role. As for me, I stayed in my position, enjoying the stability and satisfaction that came with knowing I had not only stood up for myself, but also made a lasting impact. My students continued to thrive, and I felt a renewed sense of purpose in my career. And for those wondering how my students' comic book ended, well, the final panel summed it up perfectly. The art hero rallied the students against the angry principal, making her see the errors of her ways. But the angry principal couldn't change, so she left, and the power of happiness filled the school once again. After the principal's abrupt resignation, I expected things to calm down for a while. However, the aftermath of her exit left a strange energy in the school. The leadership vacuum at the top meant everyone was looking to fill the gap, and the district scrambled to bring in a new administrator. Until then, we were left to manage with a temporary principal, an older administrator nearing retirement. He was calm, quiet, and mostly hands-off, a complete contrast to the chaos we had experienced with our previous principal. For the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe. The students were happier, the parents seemed relieved, and even my fellow teachers were more relaxed. Without the constant fear of being micromanaged, I could fully focus on my lessons and my students' progress, and they were thriving. That spring, I decided to put on an art show featuring all of my students' work. The classroom had become a haven of creativity, with kids producing everything from comic strips to watercolor paintings, sculptures, and even collaborative murals. I wanted to give them the recognition they deserved. The event was a huge success. Parents, staff, and even some district officials showed up to admire the pieces, and I could see how proud the students were. It was one of those moments that reminded me why I had become a teacher in the first place. However, even with the toxic principal gone, her influence lingered. Some of the staff who had been close to her still tried to make things difficult for me. I noticed that the union representative, the same one who had snickered when I was placed on the teacher support plan, seemed intent on keeping an eye on me. She would drop by my classroom unannounced, pretending to be friendly but clearly fishing for reasons to criticize my work. I knew I couldn't let my guard down completely, even with the change in leadership. One afternoon, after dismissing my last class of the day, I found myself reflecting on how far I had come since the start of the school year. The long hours, the stress, and the uncertainty had all taken their toll, but I had survived. More than that, I had thrived in spite of it all. But I knew the fight wasn't completely over. There was still the matter of my final evaluation. Although the temporary principal seemed to be hands-off, I had learned not to assume anything in this school. My future in the district still depended on that end-of-year evaluation, and I knew there were forces still working against me. The day finally came. I was scheduled for a formal classroom observation that would play a huge role in determining whether my contract would be renewed. I had been preparing for weeks, meticulously planning every detail of the lesson. My goal was to showcase the creativity and engagement of my students and demonstrate my ability to manage the classroom effectively. That morning, I arrived at school early, as usual, to make sure everything was ready. I went over my lesson plan one last time, setting up materials for the students' group project. We were working on a collaborative mural that combined elements of surrealism and abstract art, something I had introduced after realizing how much my students enjoyed blending different styles. As the time for the observation approached, my heart raced. It wasn't the students I was worried about. I had built such a strong rapport with them, and they were always eager to participate. It was the uncertainty of how I would be judged, especially with some of the lingering influences in the school. To my surprise, when the time came, both the temporary principal and the district supervisor, the same one who had become my ally, showed up for the observation. I hadn't expected him to come, but seeing him walk in with his laptop in hand reassured me. I knew he would be fair. The temporary principal, while more of a formality at this point, sat quietly in the back of the room, nodding politely. The class began, and the energy in the room was electric. My students dove into the mural project with enthusiasm, discussing colors, patterns, and how they wanted to represent different emotions through their artwork. I moved between the groups, offering guidance when needed, but mostly allowing them to take the lead. It was everything I had hoped for, a perfect demonstration of creative thinking, collaboration, and independent learning. As the observation continued, I noticed the supervisor typing away on his laptop, occasionally looking up to observe the interactions in the classroom. At one point, he smiled and gave me a subtle thumbs up, which gave me the confidence boost I needed. After the observation ended, I felt a wave of relief. The lesson had gone exactly as planned, and the students had shined. Still, I knew I had to wait for the official feedback before I could fully relax. A week later, the results of my final evaluation came in. I was rated as exceeding expectations in every category. Not only did I feel vindicated after everything I had been through, but I also felt a renewed sense of purpose. This was the validation I had been waiting for, proof that I belonged in this profession, despite the obstacles thrown in my way. The next school year started on a much brighter note. The district hired a new permanent principal, someone with a reputation for being supportive and encouraging to both staff and students. The toxic environment that had once poisoned the school had finally dissipated. I noticed a shift in the overall morale of the staff. People smiled more, shared ideas more freely, and collaborated without fear of being undermined. It was the kind of school I had always dreamed of working in. As for my students, they continued to inspire me every day. We expanded our projects, taking on more ambitious works like community art installations, and even entering some local competitions. The sense of accomplishment I felt, both in my personal growth and in my students' success, made all the struggles of that first year worth it. Looking back, I realized that my resilience had not only allowed me to survive that tumultuous time, but had also made me a stronger and more empathetic teacher. I had learned how to advocate for myself and my students, how to navigate difficult professional dynamics, and most importantly, how to keep going when everything seemed impossible. The former principal, the one who had caused so much chaos, was long gone from the district. Last I heard, she had taken a teaching job an hour away, after failing to hold on to another administrative position. It seemed that her reign of terror had finally come to an end, though the damage she had done still echoed in the memories of those who had worked under her. In the end, I knew I had made the right choice by sticking it out, by not letting the system beat me down. And though it was a hard-fought battle, I emerged on the other side, not only a better teacher, but also someone who had reclaimed control of their career and future. As for my students, well, they never forgot about the comic book that one of them had created, and neither did I. It remained a symbol of everything we had overcome together. The art hero had triumphed over the angry principal, and the school was filled with happiness once again. Thank you for watching.